I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome Erich Schwartzel and Ying Zhu to this discussion. There's many sort of tectonic things happening in China today, but I think what may help us sort of understand what's going on is to look at some other earlier experiences or interactions between the US and China. And one of them, of course, was Hollywood's infatuation with China, an effort to really join the Chinese film industry market. And both Erich and Ying have written wonderful books, very thoughtful, well-researched, and interesting books about that experience. And what's made reading them for me so interesting is that this is not just a sort of narrative of the odyssey of Hollywood's attempts to connect with China, but really the experience, and we will talk about that today, is almost a metaphor for, I think, the kind of experiences that many other institutions, businesses, and whatnot have had in China as well. Namely, tremendous enthusiasm, a lot of excitement about the size of the China market, and tremendous amounts of effort put into forging some sort of a relationship. But very often, the whole hope comes a cropper. And I think in this sense, Hollywood's experience in China, as I said, is emblematic of many, many other kinds of institutions, from universities to businesses to civil society organizations, even, I should say, bilateral relationships between countries. So let's start off. And I wonder, I think both of you would agree that the relationship between Hollywood and China and the Chinese film industry that started with such hope and such enthusiasm really had a rather bitter ending. But let's start with you, Erich. Just tell us why you got interested in this and how did it all begin?
Well, I'm glad you used the word infatuation, Orville, because I feel like I came to this story in the heat of that infatuation. I think if we see the early days of the Hollywood-China relationship from starting in the mid-90s, if we're going to use these sort of brackets, like let's say mid-90s to present day, the modern market, I think it starts as a courtship. It becomes a very awkward marriage, and we are now in a rather acrimonious divorce. But I came to it in the heat of that marriage. I'd say as much of a honeymoon period as Hollywood and China had. When I joined the journal in the LA bureau here, I was 26, and it was 2013. And in 2013, I think Hollywood studios had really woken up to the economic power of the Chinese market. There had been enough high-profile examples of massive hits in the country. I'm thinking of movies like Avatar that showed that there were tickets to be sold in China. But then the other thing that was happening concurrently was that Chinese financiers were coming to Hollywood and bankrolling productions and looking to invest in productions. And so suddenly this market that had been little more than an afterthought had become two critical sources of revenue, one in ticket sales and the other in behind the scenes financing. And so this infatuation that you described really, when I landed in Los Angeles, really seemed to be driving people quite crazy. I mean, there were efforts to cast Chinese actresses in Hollywood movies because there was hope that that would bolster interest in China for certain films. There were efforts to offload and sell production companies to Chinese financiers showing up with what's felt like limitless amounts of cash. And there was a real sense that the Chinese market, which at that point was still relatively small, was inevitably going to be the world's biggest, and that Hollywood's future would depend on accessing that market, which of course raised not only, concerns about how do we make our movies as appealing as possible to the Chinese audience, but how do we make sure that they continue to pass muster with the Chinese authorities who are censoring films or approving films for release. That was 2013. I didn't know at the time that I was witnessing really just one chapter in this relationship, because I think it was only 3 or 4 years later that we started to see the break form and Hollywood and China's relationship really start to distance.
So, Ying Zhu, there was that great 19th century hope that if every, and I use the word that they used back then, if every Chinaman would only add 1 inch to his shirt tail, they would keep the mills of Lancashire spinning for a generation. There was something of that, wasn't there, in the early days of what Erich has described as a courtship between Hollywood and the Chinese film industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to bounce back to what you said, so the infatuation goes both ways. It's not just the Hollywood who has been eyeing the Chinese market, but also there's a genuine affection of Chinese audiences for Hollywood films. So it goes both ways. And I kind of wanted to quickly, say what I see as the current state of the relationship. All these has, happened historically. So there's ups and downs, right? And history tends to repeat itself. I tend to say now we're not necessarily at the state of divorce, but rather, we're hitting the reset button, right? Largely responding to the kind of larger political, cultural, economic dynamic, particularly, against the background of a Sino-US relation, the whipsaw of a Sino-US relation. So I think that's sort of, what I see, this is that. And it's also difficult given the kind of restricted access now, for us to really gauge what's going on in China. So that makes it difficult to say, how much the cooling off is the result of the regulations rather than Chinese audiences continued infatuation with Hollywood films, but you do see a kind of cooling down. And audiences also, even though they do continue to enjoy Hollywood films, they also are looking for different types of Hollywood films instead of Marvels, superhero movies and so on and so forth.
I mean, of course, Hollywood around the world, of course, is a kind of a dream machine, isn't it? So talk a little bit about how, Chinese viewed Hollywood, and maybe when you were growing up, what your view was, and what the evolution of sort of the Chinese vision of Hollywood was. And then, Erich, I want to ask you just to put that shoe on the other foot and describe the evolution of sort of mythology and dream in Hollywood of the Chinese market. But let's start with you, Ying.
Yeah, so my book basically, to his credit, it's different from Erich's approach. Mine is really sort of trying to understand how we get to where we are, and how film comes to occupy such a kind of prominent place in our thinking about, even at this point, Sino-US relation. So I do see the kind of symbiotic relation between film industries and national governments. And so that goes both US and China. And in terms of the Sino-Hollywood relationship, my book actually teases out a lot of similarities in its developmental pattern in terms of the origin and early evolution. Like Hollywood, Chinese film industry started out as a commercial, decentralized industry, private run, not until 1949, 1950. In fact, Chinese film industries basically followed a kind of a market, an operation, and Chinese film industry pretty much emulated Hollywood-style studio approach, and also its narrative storytelling formula.
This is until 1949 and the Chinese Communist Party's liberation of China.
That's right. So up until, starting from the early 20th century, up until all the way until 1950, And Hollywood pretty much occupied at times up to 80% of Chinese market. And so it created this kind of, a very complex feelings. There's infatuation, there's apprehension, there's also competition, right? The desire to compete. Because Hollywood occupied such a big market in China, so the Chinese government constantly put on defense, right? And there's also a lot of complaints about Hollywood's representation of China, the so-called China humiliating images and pictures and so on and so forth. So the reception of Hollywood in China is rather complex. And the KMT, the Chinese government during the KMT era wasn't in a very effective position to regulate Hollywood, and things changed in 1950 as the founding of the PRC and the outbreak of the Korean War, which basically led to the ban of Hollywood altogether in China. Although my books kind of tease out, even though on the surface from 1950s all the way to the late 1970s, supposedly there was no Hollywood films because officially they were banned, but there was actually quite a number of Hollywood films, subtitled in Chinese, kind of circulate as the so-called internal reference films in the Chinese market, well, not necessarily market, actually, upon the Chinese top party echelon under the direct control of Madame Mao, who was once upon a time a minor actress in China, and who turns out to be a closet fan of Hollywood. So this is kind of very interesting, complex reactions, for the Chinese towards Hollywood films, and so that pattern has continued. Mm-hmm. So this kind of push and pull pattern has continued until this day.
And so, Erich, you live in LA. You're following the film industry now. Describe for us when the first sort of flickers of excitement began to ripple through Hollywood in terms of the China market, and give us a little sense of how it evolved.
I think there were a couple moments where those flickers of excitement started to spread throughout the industry. When I was researching my book, I wanted to place the Hollywood-China relationship in the context of soft power, and how, as Ying was describing, for much of the 20th century, Hollywood films were sweeping the world, and then there came a moment where they were cut off from, most of them were cut off from Chinese audiences. And what I learned this phrase that stuck in my head when I was researching the book that said that Hollywood had allowed America to become an empire by invitation, that there had been this kind of gravitational pull toward the U.S. that the movies had helped foment, and then yet here you have this massive population largely cut off from that influence, and really when the first movies started re-entering the Chinese market starting in 1994, it was through a distribution deal that had been largely cooked up to try and wean Chinese audiences off of piracy, because the studios were aware of the pirated VHS market in China that was quite popular, and obviously, as you can imagine, quite frustrating to executives who wanted to have more legitimate sources of revenue out of this population. And so,
in fact, Eric, if I may just say, I remember during that era picking up a complete set of all the Coen brothers films for about $5. That must have been 20 or 30 videos.
Right, several of which, so not only is it a good deal, but those are probably several titles that were likely not going to get approved by the Ministry of Propaganda to screen in Chinese theaters either.
More than a few.
Right.
Yeah, very quickly, actually. So this is how Chinese film school students or film department at various university students have access. This is how they learn in Hollywood films and learn the crafts of Hollywood films.
Right.
So the kind of informal pirated copy, right?
Right. I mean, I talked to a former head of Warner Brothers who would describe going over to China and then walking down the street and seeing movies that were screening in theaters elsewhere for sale for $1, with perfectly photoshopped covers and everything. And so really it's ironic to think about now, but really getting movies into Chinese theaters back in the 90s was not really seen as a money-making venture. It was just sort of seen as a bit of a stop against the illegitimate market that was forming there. Nonetheless, as Ying alluded to, there was this kind of automatic and insatiable desire for more Hollywood movies, and for I mean, I would talk to theater owners who would describe getting some of those early titles, and there were movies like The Fugitive, the Harrison Ford movie, Broken Arrow with John Travolta was another, and people would come back again and again and again to see them over and over again. But because ticket prices were so low, and the country was so vastly underscreened relative to its population, the ultimate grosses coming back to Los Angeles were not going to get any studio chief that excited. I would say there were a couple moments where that starts to change. They're actually both courtesy of James Cameron. One in 1997 with the release of Titanic, which makes a little bit more than $50 million in the Chinese market. And then about 10 years later with the release of Avatar, when it made more than $200 million. That I think those are two grosses, two performances where the studio chiefs back here in LA started to sit up and notice. And then from there, it was just a matter of looking at where the ticket sales were growing, right? I mean, there was a point where Chinese theaters were adding 27 screens a day, and ticket sales were registering double-digit year-over-year growth at a time when ticket sales in much of the world were stagnant or declining. So there became this shift where I'd say probably around 2009, 2010, where it didn't really take too robust an analysis to see that China was where the growth was going to be.
So speaking very, very quickly, just a response. So speaking of Avatar, now, of course, we know the big news is Avatar just secured China release, which is a real big news. And so the upcoming Avatar. So the other thing you talk about in terms of piracy, now, when Hollywood returned to China, and is starting really actually in the early 1980s. Now, because in the early 1980s is where all these kind of one-time low budget B movies started to enter China. So these were not revenue sharing films. And at the time, Jack Valentine was the head of MPPA, right? So the two foremost goals for him was to try to eventually extend the market share in Hollywood's market share in China, and also to try to crack down on piracy, right? So that has been the kind of threat throughout the negotiation between Hollywood and China, those two main issues. And looking at now, we're back to square one. The piracy continues to run rampant in China, particularly at this moment where we no longer have this normal channel of negotiation, right? So it's very difficult to get cooperation from the Chinese part to do that. And so the market restriction continues. So it's a kind of very interesting, it goes to cyclical now. So now back to square one.
Well, in many ways, I think the whole relationship is sort of returned to a state many decades ago when we were decoupled, and we're actually decoupling again. You mentioned, Erich, that Avatar and Titanic before it, and that in a certain sense, if that got the attention of Hollywood, because they could see they could make big bucks in China, it also got the attention of the Chinese Communist Party, didn't it? And what was their conclusion when they saw these blockbusters just ripping through the Chinese theaters and hogging 70 to 80% of the Chinese box office?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, both responses were, I think, really illustrative of where the Communist Party saw this industry going on, within its own borders. When it came to Titanic, there's this fascinating speech that Jiang Zemin gives around the time of its release, where he encourages his fellow party members to see the film, and there are several themes of the movie that I think align with his values, right, and what he might want them to absorb from the film. Certainly, it's the kind of movie where the class struggle is quite literal, right? We've got three classes of passengers on the Titanic. Our hero is in third class. The evil henchmen are in first class. But he says it as this fascinating quote where he says, we should see this film, even though it's a bit of a celebration of the excesses of capitalism. So he allows for that, right? He says, it should remind us, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says it should remind us that we are not the only ones who know how to convince people, how to persuade people. And there's this sort of acknowledgement that this kind of softer cultural power is really captivating and really, that no one can really avoid it. And
that's what the Communist Party really wants to get a piece of, don't they? They want some of that secret sauce for their own propaganda campaigns.
Exactly. And also, and this really is, I think, a theme that has come to the fore in the last 4 or 5 years as we've seen China's native domestic industry really explode within its own borders. But it's a theme and it's a consideration that you see even as far back as the mid-90s. And then I think with Avatar, you have a response that I think is illuminating when it comes to the market realities of China's relationship with Hollywood. And that is, as Avatar is performing as well as it is and selling out auditorium after auditorium, the Communist Party officials get a little nervous that it might be doing too well, because there's always this concern, largely an optics concern, that they don't want it to ever look like the Chinese people prefer Hollywood movies over Chinese films. And so at the end of the year, what's that?
It's like vaccines.
Sure. I mean, to your introduction, I mean, like it can feel a little absurd at times, but I'm telling you, you can really find in the Hollywood-China relationship any sort of case study to apply to any kind of sector or relations between the two countries. And so when Avatar is doing really well, there's some anxiety around that, and what that might look like if it appears as though Hollywood is doing a better job of entertaining Chinese citizens than Chinese filmmakers are. And so a number of screens that are showing the movie see the film removed from those auditoriums and replaced with a biopic of Confucius, as though to say, not only are Chinese audiences not, as interested in Avatar as you think, they'd rather see this, they'd rather eat their vegetables and see a movie about this Chinese hero. And it's an early lesson for Hollywood that they will not be sort of operating in a free market. They will always have to sort of weigh these considerations, and in some cases, too much success can backfire in unexpected ways.
So let me just jump in very quickly. So you're talking about when Avatar was asked to exit the 2D screening, just to be available on the 3D screening, it was up against one of the biggest films, Confucius. So that was the hero. You're talking about Confucius, right? And so. So one complexity is that the demand, I have to say, it's not just coming from the government, it's also from the industry. Chinese domestic industry, Chinese domestic studios too want to have a piece of the domestic market. So that adds complexity. And so that's kind of, and speaking of the kind of earlier, Orville was asking me about, the kind of early Sino-Hollywood relation. And I see this pattern of Sino-Hollywood relation, which is this kind of, you alluded to earlier, this kind of unequal power relation, right? So the Sino-Hollywood relation was initially more of kind of apprenticeship, right? As the two parties were by no means equal in finance or technology and in popular appeal. And China makes a big deal of Hollywood film, which is actually, of course, a hat tip to Hollywood for its influence. But China, I think, as earlier, Orville was asking, so China was determined to draft Hollywood into its own image lifting campaign, given that the Chinese films have been performed dismal overseas, and they needed to kind of riding the height of Hollywood, use Hollywood's expertise, right, to really, promoting the Chinese image. So in many ways, there's a transitional relationship between the governments and between the studios, aside from the fact that audiences have genuine affection for many of these Hollywood films. And then the film industry, the Chinese domestic film industry, of course, is in a kind of very interesting, position. And you see also the clash between the theater chain owners, right? The distributors, they want more Hollywood films because Hollywood films opens the market, right? But the domestic studios, they might not want to do that. So throughout the history, Chinese film industry actually actively lobbied for the government to come up with protective policies, which applies to, I think, not just to China, and many other countries as well, up against the kind of onslaught of Hollywood films.
So let me ask you both, in this little sort of quadrille that's being danced between Hollywood and China, obviously Hollywood wants to get in and get the big Chinese market. The party is very wary because they recognize Hollywood is incredibly seductive. And lurking behind this little awkward dance, of course, is two very different political systems and value systems. Hollywood films are emphasizing individuals and pleasure and rights, all of these things. And Chinese films are not. So what role do you each think that these sort of value systems and political systems in the background, how did that play out on what happened between the effort of Hollywood to get into China and then finally China's effort to get into the global film market itself?
Yeah. So I guess the question really, you put it differently. So what makes Hollywood so popular? Why is Hollywood so popular?
No, I think my question is not that. I mean, we all know that Hollywood is a popular dream machine, but the Chinese Communist Party has a very clear set of parameters in which culture must operate. That's very different than Hollywood.
Right. The other side of the coin is, why isn't Chinese film popular? Why isn't Chinese film selling, right, across the board? And never mind that the Chinese has been, over the past few decades, emulating, actively Hollywood methods. So what is it? So Erich, do you want to start? I do have some thoughts about that, actually. So I think we do actually have to talk about why is Hollywood popular, right? Why can't Chinese cinema compete with Hollywood in the global market, given that Chinese film industry now has the money to buy the new technology? In fact, they have the money to buy all the expertise. They have the money to hire, the Hollywood stars, Hollywood, creative team and so on and so forth, but still they cannot make the film that sell. Then I think we'll have to look at what makes Hollywood sell, right? I think there's Hollywood's global success really kind of relies upon this kind of accumulative reputation of American films as the state of art in production and marketing, and a tour de force in storytelling. And also the crucial thing is, I think, although you're asking this question, which is the universal appeal of American popular culture and lifestyle, right? So that's the third part, is what's lacking in Chinese cinema. So and so that's kind of a part of I get asked this question: why isn't Chinese film doing better overseas? I think when you look at it, so what is the genuine appeal here? And also, speaking of
genuine appeal is obviously that Hollywood tells a hell of a good story, and they don't have any constraints from the government. Let me ask you, Erich. I mean, what do you think the values proposition? How does that corrupt the relationship or the ability of these two giant industries on different sides of the divide to work something out together?
Well, I think in the case of Hollywood, it's ensured that movies for the past decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, have been made with this kind of shadow influence in mind. I think it's hard to find, it's impossible to find a major studio writing checks to greenlight massive movies that aren't thinking in some way about China, if not in what they're going to put on screen, in that they need to avoid themes or issues or actors who might jeopardize or threaten other business holdings in the country. And so I think in terms of values, it's pretty effectively muzzled some major values of the American entertainment system. Now, it's also, I think, created these scenarios that can sometimes be unintentionally hilarious. I remember there was a story that I was told by Dan Glickman, who was one of the successors to Jack Valenti, who Ying mentioned as the head of the MPAA. So basically the film industry's head lobbyist. And he had gone to China in the early 2000s, and there had been a movie that had been released. I'm not sure anyone's really talked about this movie since it had come out, but it was a movie that had come out called In Good Company. And it was a romantic comedy about a young guy who takes a job at a firm. He replaces the boss, this older man, and then starts dating that older man's daughter. So it's kind of it's a workplace comedy, fish out of water type story. And it had not been approved for release in China by the party censors. And Glickman says, what gives? Like, why? I mean, this is not a movie about the Dalai Lama. This is not a movie about Tiananmen Square. There's nothing sensitive in this script. And the party official explains to him that it's actually, if you think about it, it's a story about not respecting the older generation. And it's a story about taking over for an older generation and really not really respecting authority. And that is a theme that the party does not really want to foment or to have in its borders in any way, large or small, silly or serious. And you think about, I mean, I would say, to your point, Orville, like not only are we accustomed to an American film industry that kind of operates without government oversight or government insight, but it's also an industry that we've looked toward for stories of the outsider, stories of rebels without a cause, right? And so I think it's really in a way forced for the first time in recent history, forced those storytellers to reconsider some of those themes if they want to maintain that access to the Chinese market. So I think what the enormity of the Chinese market has really allowed is for an American industry that is largely playing by China's rules.
So, Ying, that's interesting. What Erich just said, I'm curious to get your reaction that finally what happened was that what started off to be something of a free market proposition, American films, you get 10 can go in and then they let more in. But, whatever it was, they could go in if they weren't too, anti-Chinese Communist Party. But ultimately, they had to come to heel. They either had to do the party's bidding or they would be shut out. And that's sort of where we are today, isn't it? This chronic sense in China that if you borrow too much from the West, it makes you look enfeebled and you're unequal, and it's almost an exploitative, victimizing relationship. Do you think that is partially what animates China's deep concern about too many American films being screened on Chinese screens?
Yeah, absolutely. So this puts actually the domestic Chinese film industry in a bound. So one kind of consistent theme running through the Sino-US relationship is the fuel of nationalism, particularly in the Chinese part, the Chinese nationalism, which, as you alluded to, which combines the kind of narrative of a national humiliation, right? The idea that it emphasizes China's mistreatment by foreign aggressors, right? And with this kind of victor narrative, which emphasizes the role party plays either KMT or CCP in leading the nation to overcome victimhood. And so this kind of twin narrative contribute to this kind of China's paradoxical sense of, grievance and entitlement, and also kind of a self-aggrandizing, right, which kind of have colored the state-sponsored Chinese films. This is the kind of film they produce. It's kind of ingrained in this Chinese psyche, among the mainstream Chinese film practitioners as well. A lot of them is not necessarily top down. It's also that's part of who they are, right? And also you look out throughout the Chinese film history, is competing interests between enlightenment and entertainment, right? And which is characterized by political patronage during the KMT era, and now the political coalition during the People's Republic of China during the Mao era. And so that means that the kind of products the Chinese filmmakers can come up with are very limited, right? They follow the same kind of pattern, and that entails a lot of self-censorship. Although I kind of tend to be nervous when I talk about self-censorship, because a lot of times it's part of the, it's kind of your DNA already. You're not even aware that you are censoring yourself. And so that has tarnished the Chinese cinema's reputation and also competitiveness in the global market. That gets back to the kind of same issue that I've been thinking about the question. So why doesn't Chinese film sell overseas, which is the question I get asked a lot. I think a lot of it has to do with the reputation issue. It's kind of very difficult to
in fact, Chinese films don't sell until recently very well in China if they have to compete with Avatar and Titanic. And thus, it seems to me there was already implicit from the very beginning of this transaction between Hollywood and China that if the Hollywood films were successful, they were going to be constrained because it would shut out the Chinese film industry, which couldn't compete on a story level, a sex appeal level, and on any level.
Right. So there's a political calculation. There's also industries' competitive stance, domestic industry competitive stance against Hollywood too. And there's a kind of underbrewing patriotism among the certain segment of the grassroots. So yes, China is afraid of this kind of onslaught influence of Hollywood, and so that continues absolutely. Yeah.
So Erich, there are a whole group of Chinese directors that are sort of shut out of their own market, aren't they? And they can send their films to film festivals abroad and maybe get seen in some art theaters. But how would you describe that group? And is that group, in your view, if it was a free and open market, would they do well in China, or are they indelibly contaminated with a kind of a Western bias and only can survive in a Western market?
It's hard to say. Orville, I think one arc that I identified when I was reporting my book was just that as China's film industry grew larger and larger, it exercised a gravitational pull of its own, and there were many filmmakers who had been working in Hong Kong, which was long considered a market that was, not only obviously much freer than working in mainland China, but also kind of celebrated around the world as sort of this epicenter of really interesting global film. Many Hong Kong filmmakers have since gone and worked for companies in Beijing. And I think a similar thing has happened with the most famous kind of collection of filmmakers that you're talking about, which would be the fifth generation in the 1980s. So the filmmakers behind movies like Farewell My Concubine, or I'm sure between the three of us we could name a dozen of these titles that seem to have appeared almost seemingly out of nowhere. And as you said, irony of ironies, were celebrated on the world stage and at these massive film festivals, but largely shut out or banned from their home market. What was interesting to observe was how many of those filmmakers who were once considered kind of the auteurs who were bucking the system are nonetheless now much more sanctioned, doing much more sanctioned work for the state. And if not for the state, then doing movies that the government has no problem approving for release. So it was one thing I noticed.
True with art and literature and with every form of culture, is it not?
Right. Well, absolutely. And I think there's a little bit of a messy parallel to be drawn between the European filmmaking capitals of the early 20th century and Hollywood. As Hollywood grew and became the world's largest film industry, there was a similar kind of recruiting that took place where filmmakers like F.W. Murnau came over from Europe because Hollywood was where you could get the biggest budgets and where you could tell the biggest stories. And there's some similar dynamic happening here with some of these filmmakers going to mainland China to work there. But it was one thing I noticed time and time again, these names you might be introduced to from researching the 80s or 90s somehow kind of inevitably end up working in some capacity in a more sanctioned way.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about these figures. You're talking about Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, Tian Zhuangzhuang. These are the leading figures of Chinese first generation. So they are the father figures of Chinese film now, and so they are occupying crucial positions. They're in so it's a different. The roles have changed, so to speak. For Chen Kaige, for instance, is officially the head of Shanghai Film Academy, right? So they are in a different position now. And of course, Zhang Yimou has made a cluster of a big blockbuster state-sponsored films, including directing the Beijing Olympic in 2008. So yeah, I think that part of this is also when you reach certain stature, so your role changes. That's also part of the conventional progression. On the other hand, I do want to say that small scale Chinese films that not necessarily promoted by the government still manage to circulate among the film festival circuits continuously. Though the numbers of these films have dwindled significantly.
Do you think that under the sort of reign of Xi Jinping, it seems to me that the film worlds are liable to decouple even more now, because not only is there a stronger ideological bias, but markets are pulling apart. And it would look to me like we're heading back to the period that I remember so vividly when I first started studying China, where there were two discrete cultural worlds, two discrete worlds of film, discrete worlds of almost everything.
I think that is happening, but I don't think it leads to a world where here in Los Angeles, the studios stop caring about China or are suddenly given a long leash of free expression. And I don't see a world where they're dusting off the Tiananmen Square script or any script that antagonizes China in some way. And part of that is because every major studio right now, there really are only 5, and they're all part of these much bigger corporate parents, these conglomerates that if they, the Chinese box office is just one element of the business that they have in China. So take a company like Disney, which has had really just a lousy 2 or 3 years here of trying to get movies into Chinese theaters. They also, though, have a $5 billion theme park outside of Shanghai. They have toys that they're selling. They have TV shows that they're licensing. So I think, we've seen in the past how China will punish a company anywhere it can, right? Like it might not necessarily target the division that made the offending film if it wants to sort of enact some retribution for spreading a narrative or telling a story that it disagrees with. So I actually think that I haven't seen a major change in the stakes involved for a lot of these companies, even if the Chinese box office as one element seems to be closing.
I agree. So from day one, U.S. sees actually Hollywood films not just as a film, but it's something that actually helped to sell the consumer product abroad. And of course, now the studio itself has all these, franchising, auxiliary market, affiliate toys and stuff to sell. So absolutely, that's the key thing. It's not just about film itself. It's about, it's more than just a film. Film is just only a little teaser, frankly speaking. And so that has been the pattern. And I don't see, which is why I said I don't see a divorce anytime soon or ever. I think it's just kind of torturous, a fitful relationship that, it kind of continues, it goes up and downs. Again, because the market is so huge.
But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that, China has virtually no market in America, but the Americans have a big market in China through things other than film, and they're all wrapped up in the same conglomerate. So in a certain sense, would you agree that maybe China has won this struggle? They've neutered the American film industry, and yet they haven't been able to internationalize their own industry.
Well, that was the failure, right? So on their part, it's the failure of not being able to riding, the boat of Hollywood going abroad. They failed to do that.
Well, they failed to do that, but they succeeded in neutering Hollywood in China.
Yes, they have. they have to agree.
I think you yourself said that there is a habitual and ruthless suppression of any alternative narrative in China.
Absolutely. So, which probably explains why the relationship will continue, because Hollywood is not going to washing hands with the market. It's so seductive. The market is so huge, and so that yes, so that is part of the equation.
So, Eric, how do you?
I would just add one thing though, which is that I think it's important to remember though that China's ambition to internationalize its films and distribute its films around the world is really looking outside the U.S. I agree that I think that the time of a Chinese movie, selling out auditoriums in America is very far away, if it will ever happen. But I think if you look in a lot of the other countries where China's influence and presence is even more cemented, like I'm thinking specifically of the Belt and Road countries, there's already a really robust effort to export Chinese culture to those countries. The example I looked at in my book most closely is in Kenya, which just sort of emerged as this perfect case study. But you can apply the same lens to countries across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. When I was reporting the book, I noticed I would read Chinese newspapers every morning, and I started to notice this trend where if a country kind of had emerged as the Belt and Road flavor of the week, right? If there had been some announcements about a new subway system in Belgrade, or Xi Jinping had met with the president of some country, they're really usually, time and time again, a co-production treaty or some kind of cultural exchange was not far behind. And I think it's an underappreciated element of the Belt and Road program is the effort to also include TV shows, movies, musicians as part of this exchange. I spent time in remote villages far outside Nairobi, and when I would show up in the middle of the afternoon unannounced and walk inside, they were watching Chinese soap operas, they were watching Chinese kung fu movies. I think that it's just important to remember that in a lot of countries around the world, there's an openness to foreign entertainment that Americans, frankly, have not really exhibited for a long time. There's an openness, a receptiveness, and in many cases, what these viewers are seeing on screen is really just a reflection of what they're seeing off screen, which is this kind of sudden and immediate and omnipresent arrival of China.
I agree. So I observed the same phenomenon in Rwanda. So China does have a large presence for its audiovisual products in Global South, right? And so that gets the question: how do we measure success? Do we measure success by box office numbers? If it's by box office numbers, these Global South, these markets, and they do not bring in a lot of huge amount of box office because their markets are so tiny, right? The North American market continues to be the number one, even though China claimed the number one 2 years ago. But now the trend is reversing. We're talking about 2022, US market is going to be number one. And so, but the other question is the invisible measurements of influence. If you talk about influence, you do see the kind of increasing influence of China in these countries that you mentioned, largely in Global South. And yeah, so you do see, and so.
But are people enjoying the films? Do they come willingly, or is this sort of state-sponsored influence, state-subsidized, culture and propaganda? Would you say they're being successful in finding alternative markets that actually underwrite their projects?
So from what I saw, at least in Rwanda, the very fact that these films are mostly not necessarily film, but mostly TV programs. Mm-hmm. Right? They brought in by the satellite TV, and Chinese TV dramas were enormously popular. So, and people actually constantly referencing those. And I think by the very fact, by default, they are there. You turn on the TV, the programs are there. So you're just exposed to it. A lot of these kind of accumulation, you get acquainted with this particular type of program, and you get used to it, and you don't see a lot of those, partly because of the distribution restriction. You don't see a lot of those, from the US. And I haven't done a real research about the reception of these Chinese films in Global South, or particularly in Africa. So I can't say, but my sense is I think it's a little bit of both. The exposure, remember the part of the reason people start to embrace Hollywood films was because of during the World War I, we're talking about World War I, right? European film market, the film industries were deprived of finance. So they no longer produce films. So Hollywood came and Hollywood produced the films, and Hollywood was the only one who was prospering because those were the films that's available, right? So it's the fact that they're there makes a difference. I think that's the same kind of a phenomenon now. So Eric might know a little bit more if you have done research.
I would add one element, which is at Orville. I don't think these markets are underwriting projects, but I think to Ying's point, this is not an economic play. And I'll give you just one observation. In Kenya, there seems to be some acknowledgement that China's coming into the market with a few disadvantages. And the main way that it appears as though the Chinese production firms are answering to that is, Ying is right. Like a lot of it is, just the fact that you turn on the TV and the show is there. But Ying. I'm sorry?
Ying there.
Exactly. Yes. And one interesting phenomenon is that, American firms that are shipping their movies and TV shows to Kenya, they don't pay to dub the dialogue into local languages often because the market's so small, it's not worth it. And so they'll just subtitle it. Chinese firms are much more likely to dub their programs and shoulder that additional cost because it seems they know that given the choice between a dubbed Chinese show and a subtitled American show, audiences are probably more likely to watch a dubbed Chinese show. So it seems like as though they're paying to close that gap in appeal, if there might still be one.
Let me ask you both, since we're coming to the end of the hour here, having done your research, written your books, what do you think the message is that you'd like to convey? What have we learned about Hollywood and China trying to converge and ultimately not being able to do it very successfully? Ying, let's start with you. Do you want to comment on what you think your book sort of teaches us about how the experience of these two film industries trying to find a kind of a mutually beneficial relationship?
Well, are you asking me to start or
Yes.
Eric?
No, I'm asking you.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
We're starting off.
Right.
What lessons do you take away from writing your book about the U.S., China, or China's relationship to the world?
Yeah. Although, the book, the big chunk of book is really describes rather than kind of prescribe. But I think the takeaway is really, if you're looking at, pull back, looking at history in a kind of a long length, right? And I think it repeats itself. The history is cyclical, and the kind of delicate dance will continue, and the negotiation will continue. That's for the Chinese. But to what extent? I think that really the question really is. How do we assess this relationship from whose perspective, to what end? I think that probably is kind of a different way of looking at this. So, really depending on where you stand. If you ask regulators from both sides, they have conflicting demands, right? If you're asking film industry practitioners, they have their own position, right? I think for the industry practitioners, they very much want the relationship to continue, right? So therefore they can profit. And so there's the audiences too. Audiences want to have access. So I think depending on, it's all in the hands of these so-called major stakeholders. So who are the major stakeholders? And I don't have a conclusion, but I do think it's important. The bottom line is, doesn't matter whose relationship, who has upper hand. I think it's important that we, both industries should allow for the kind of flourishing of diverse set of the films, right? Not just the Marvels, not just the Chinese propaganda films. We want a film that has genuine human touch. Films. We're talking about in the 1990s, the To Live, Blue Kites, films like this, real good quality films.
So Jeffrey, what do you take away from your experience of writing this book in terms of what it tells us about the ability of these two sectors from these two very different countries, cultures, and values, their inability really to find a workable relationship?
Well, I mean, I think I appreciated how you framed this conversation earlier as one of values, because I think that is what I wanted to convey with my book, which is not only have we seen this major artery of free expression in the U.S. corrupted by this other country, this other market, and really have been living for about 25 years now under its watch when it comes to the stories that can be told on screen. I also think, though, that to return to my experience in Kenya and the experience of a lot of people overseas, I think it's important to remember that in some cases the future of whether or not Chinese entertainment or American entertainment is shown around the world might not be up to audiences to be at all. I mean, when I was in Kenya, I met with the Kenyan film minister, who was a very socially conservative politician, who had kind of gotten to where he was sort of by censoring content and sort of running these quite alarmist campaigns about what he considered regressive entertainment could do to your children. And he said to me very bluntly, he said, I love importing Chinese movies because they've already been censored, and I don't need to worry about them in infusing my country with your corrupt Western values. So I think this is something we have to be considering as we chart this future of whether or not China or the US is going to emerge as the dominant superpower. I think it has to be a question of values, and we have to acknowledge that the transfer of values and the celebrating of values and the sort of the conduit of values for the US the movies has played a huge role in that. And so what happens to those Western values if that courier is affected and influenced by a country with a different set of values?
Well, it may be that we're looking at exactly where we started, that there will be two separate worlds of culture and of film and of values.
And then that means the business plans that Hollywood studios have drafted and perfected over the last 2 decades have to be completely revised.
Yes.
It's interesting. So I think the question, so what is the kind of end game? Are we talking about, this applies to larger Sino-US relationship too. So are we talking about containment or conversion or this kind of fitful coexistence? And we will have to to see how this pans out. I want to kind of add one more thing. It's kind of interesting we talk about value, which reminds me that I kind of mentioned one of the reasons Hollywood films kind of open so well is it kind of promotes American popular culture lifestyle, which is very appealing to the rest of the world, right? So this is kind of a universal appeal. Just so happens in Orville, you probably remember in 2013, Xi Jinping came aboard, and so there were 7, I think, key terms were banned, right? And so one of the words that was banned was universal value.
This is Article 9, I think. Yeah.
That's right. So the universal value, which means the Chinese film industry actually cannot make a film that kind of use the framework of universal value. So they have to. So the Chinese film industry was basically trapped in this kind of a very militant, ethnocentric kind of a view of the world, which is resorting to the so-called Chinese tradition. In the end, if we're talking about the competing values, it's an open question, and see how things continue to evolve.
Jeffrey, before we sign off, do you have any question you'd like to pose to our 2 panelists, having listened to this hour?
I was just curious, if you thought of where was the point where the honeymoon period ended? Looking forward, you say there's the reset button has been pushed, there's divorce, but where were the first inklings of the failure? Was it based on this values, or was it based on a monetary proposition, or was there a point where it became clear there was no coexistence from a values proposition, or was it an economic decision?
I'll let Ying speak to the values question, but because I think from sitting here in Los Angeles, I can speak to the economic, which is that there was a time, it was around 2015, when a number of major financing deals that had been kind of moved from China to the US, these sort of outbound Chinese deals, started to be scrutinized by the Chinese government, because there was a fear that the deals were really just a way for Chinese financiers to get money out of the country. And there was a fear that it was going to depress China's currency. And that, frankly, this isn't how they'd like to see their billionaires spending their money. And so really overnight, what happened was Xi Jinping announced that he was going to scrutinize outbound foreign investment deals worth more than $1 billion, and with a particular eye on entertainment-related transactions. And you know enough about China to know who's going to try to get a deal through when a notice like that goes out, and the money just evaporated, and these deals just evaporated, and there were some people here in Los Angeles, I spoke to some of them who really had the worst timing imaginable. They had agreed to a deal Xi Jinping's scrutiny emerges and the deal falls apart before they can cash the check. So I think that experience of hearing time and again of so many producers or executives left without the deal closing, I think really it really left a bit of a jaundiced take in the industry on this Chinese financing and what exactly it would actually yield for most people. And so very quickly it went from how do I sell my company to a rich guy from China to a bit of a punchline, actually.
And how do you think, where do you think the witching moment was when things really changed, when people in China could no longer get their money out and people in Hollywood thought, this is probably, even though the market's big, this doesn't have a bright horizon for our company?
Yeah, like Erich said, so that was the moment, when China put a stop on the mass exodus of cash, right? So these tycoons, real estate tycoons and movie tycoons, they were called back, returned. So they all have gone back to the domestic turf. So, and that actually speaks kind of the risk of doing business with China, speaking for, economics, because they're just not a reliable partner in the end. And Hollywood cannot function without a reliable partner. So that's kind of more tangible, on the economic front, but in terms of value, really, so under Xi Jinping, China is taking a different, kind of a path, right? So, I do see that there's a divergent path and down the road. But in the long run, I tend to be optimistic. I think that things, again, history goes through cycles, right? We have seen this in China, decades, right? So there's a tumultuous political campaign one after another. And people do come out of it. But at the moment, and I do not think that, Hollywood and China, Chinese film industry, see things eye to eye, or the regulators rather. But how audiences think about this, that's another issue. And you're right, Erich, that what audiences sees are very much constrained by what they are allowed to access. But on the other hand, don't underestimate, the intelligence of audiences. They might not just go to see film simply because, and the government and the studio want them to see. And for those who have beings, they are able to bypass these restrictions and to kind of reach out, find the things that really appeal to them.
Well, there's a little hint of optimism here in the end in a relationship, which I would have to say has very little of it elsewhere. So let me thank you both. You've both written very interesting books, and I urge anyone who's curious not only about the film industry and its relationship to China, but how to judge what may happen to other sectors of economic, cultural, even political interaction. I think these two books kind of give us a hint that it's going to be some very difficult sledding going forward. And thank you, Jeffrey Sequeira, for hosting us tonight. And happy holidays to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.